The unexpected delivery. The streets of Millbrook were painted in hues of late afternoon gold, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted over every building. Arjun Nair, a lanky young man in his early 20s, gripped his delivery bike's handlebars as he maneuvered through the familiar, busy roads toward Frank's Pizza. It was his first day on the job, and his heart hammered as he raced through the streets. He couldn't afford to mess this up. His mother's medical bills demanded every bit of income he could bring home, and this job was their lifeline. As he dashed through Frank's Pizza's door, he was greeted by the intoxicating aroma of fresh dough and melted cheese, calming his frayed nerves. Gerald, the manager, stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, an intimidating scowl cemented on his face. "You must be Arjun," Gerald said, his tone as cold as a refrigerator door. "You're late." Arjun felt his face flush with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to explain but quickly shut it, sensing that Gerald wasn't the type to listen to excuses. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." Gerald gave a curt nod and handed Arjun a warm pizza box. 357 Willow Lane. Small margarita. Word of advice: just deliver and go. Don't hang around or ask questions. Got it? Arjun nodded, slightly taken aback by the warning. He swallowed his curiosity, deciding it was best to follow orders. Slinging the delivery bag over his shoulder, he stepped back into the dying daylight. The bike ride to Willow Lane started like any other delivery route, smooth and routine. But as he left the well-maintained streets of the main town, the scenery shifted dramatically. Trees grew denser, houses sat farther apart, and weeds sprouted through cracks in the sidewalk. The bustling city gave way to a quiet, almost eerie neighborhood that felt frozen in time. When he finally reached Willow Lane, Arjun could feel a strange stillness in the air. The houses were in various states of decay, their windows dark and uninviting. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though he saw no one on the empty streets. It was a far cry from the vibrant heart of Millbrook he was used to. 357 Willow Lane loomed ahead, weathered and worn, tucked into the shadows of overgrown trees. Its paint peeled off in places, and its lawn was a wild, tangled mess. Arjun took a deep breath, dismounted his bike, and made his way up the creaking, weed-choked path to the front door. The entire scene felt like something out of a ghost story. Arjun hesitated before knocking. "Pizza delivery," he called out, his voice louder than he intended, breaking the stillness. He waited, but there was no response. As he raised his hand to knock again, the door creaked open just a crack. A young girl peered out, her small face partially hidden in the shadow of the door. She looked disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, and her hair a mess. But what caught Arjun's attention was her expression. Her eyes darted nervously, and her hands trembled as they clutched a stained hot water bottle against her chest. "Are you Sophie?" Arjun asked gently, trying to ease the tension he felt in the air. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the ground, avoiding his eyes. Arjun noticed she was wearing latex gloves, stained with something dark, and a metallic, almost medicinal smell wafted from inside the house. Is everything okay?" he asked, glancing over her shoulder into the dimly lit hallway. But Sophie didn't answer. She quickly took the pizza box from his hands, her gloved fingers leaving faint smears on the cardboard. Then, without a word, she shut the door. Arjun stood there for a moment. The door closed in his face, leaving him alone with a nagging sense of unease. His instincts told him something was very wrong. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he noticed movement in the neighboring house's window. An elderly man stood there, staring at him with a blank, unsettling expression. Arjun considered walking over to ask if he knew Sophie, but Gerald's words echoed in his mind. "Just deliver and go. Don't ask questions." Reluctantly, Arjun mounted his bike and started pedaling back to Frank's Pizza. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something important behind. The ride back was a blur, his mind replaying the strange encounter with Sophie over and over. The smell, the gloves, the fear in her eyes. It all seemed like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. He reached the pizzeria, but his thoughts were still tangled up with worry. Gerald was at the counter when Arjun walked in, jotting down another order with his usual stern expression. "Another delivery to 357 Willow Lane," Gerald announced, handing Arjun another pizza box. Arjun froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Are you sure? Didn't I just deliver a pizza there?" Gerald shrugged, not looking up from the register. "Yeah, some older lady called in this time. She was very specific. Said it had to be delivered quickly." Arjun swallowed hard, his mind racing. An adult had called in this time. But earlier, it had been just Sophie. Something didn't add up, but he was caught between his rising suspicion and Gerald's no-nonsense attitude. It was just strange. "Sir," Arjun said, his voice low. "When I delivered the first one, a young girl answered the door. She seemed afraid, and there was a smell." Gerald cut him off with a dismissive wave. "People from that part of town can be strange. Don't worry about their cleanliness. Just do your job." Arjun bit back the urge to argue, nodding reluctantly. Taking the new pizza, he left the pizzeria, his mind churning with questions. He mounted his bike and began the journey back to Willow Lane, but this time, his heart felt heavier. He was carrying more than just a pizza. He was carrying a burden of doubt and concern. The closer he got to Willow Lane, the more he felt like he was walking into something dark and unknown. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a regular delivery. As the familiar, decaying houses came into view, Arjun steeled himself for what lay ahead, unaware that this delivery would change his life forever. Unsettling discoveries. Arjun's heart beat faster as he approached 357 Willow Lane for the second time that day. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the neighborhood, and long shadows stretched from the surrounding trees, giving the entire street a haunted appearance. He had hoped that his earlier visit was a fluke, that perhaps the strange encounter with Sophie and the unsettling smell were just random, isolated details he'd overthought. But now, returning here with another pizza, he couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was very wrong. As he dismounted his bike, Arjun looked up and down the deserted street, feeling a chill creep up his spine. The houses stood in silence, their windows dark and empty like hollow eyes watching him. He took a deep breath, trying to focus on the task at hand. Just deliver and go, he reminded himself, though he felt the advice slip away as he approached the door. He rang the doorbell and waited, the pizza box warm in his hands. His finger lingered on the button, pressing it once more when he heard footsteps approach from inside. The door creaked open, and once again Sophie appeared in the doorway. She looked even more disheveled than before, her clothes streaked with what looked like fresh smears of dirt. Her small hands, still covered in latex gloves, clutched a stained towel this time, and the smell from earlier was stronger, more pungent. "Sophie," Arjun asked gently, fighting the urge to back away. "Is everything okay here? I brought your pizza." Sophie's eyes darted around, never quite meeting his gaze. She seemed anxious, her fingers trembling as she reached for the pizza box. Arjun's curiosity overpowered his caution. He held onto the box a moment longer, forcing her to look up at him. "Is there an adult here?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "I heard an older woman called in this order. Are you alone, Sophie?" She flinched, as if his words had somehow stung her, and for a split second, he thought she might start crying. But instead, she gripped the pizza box tightly and nodded toward the darkened hallway behind her. My grandmother is resting," she whispered, almost too quietly for him to hear. She isn't well." Arjun's eyes followed her gaze into the shadows of the house. He could just make out the edge of a staircase leading to the upper floor and a dimly lit hallway that stretched into the back of the house. It was dark, too dark for the early evening, and he could feel a heavy, oppressive atmosphere lingering within the walls. "Do you need any help?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is she okay?" Sophie hesitated, her small frame seeming to shrink under his concerned stare. She looked down at her gloved hands, her fingers tightening around the towel, and mumbled, We're fine. Thank you." Before he could press further, she took a step back, pulling the door slightly close. Arjun swallowed, realizing he had overstepped. He took a step back himself, feeling a knot of frustration and worry twist inside him. "All right, Sophie," he said slowly, his voice gentle. "If you ever need anything, just ask, okay?" She nodded quickly and closed the door, leaving him standing alone on the porch. Arjun lingered there for a moment, staring at the closed door, the worry gnawing at him more intensely than ever. As he turned to head back to his bike, he glanced once more at the neighboring house. The old man who had watched him earlier was still there, his silhouette barely visible through the dusty window. The man's blank, almost vacant expression sent a chill through him. Arjun felt compelled to approach the neighboring house, to ask the man if he knew anything about Sophie and her grandmother. Maybe he could shed some light on the strange situation. But as he took a step toward the house, a loud noise from behind him made him jump. He whipped around, looking back at 357 Willow Lane, and realized that it had come from inside. The noise had sounded like something heavy crashing to the floor, followed by a muffled cry. His pulse quickened, and he moved back to the front door, pressing his ear against it, straining to hear what was happening inside. Silence, but the muffled cry echoed in his mind, refusing to let him walk away. His hand hovered over the doorbell, uncertain. "Sophie," he called softly, hoping she'd hear him. "Is everything all right?" There was no answer, only an eerie silence from the other side of the door. Arjun felt torn. Gerald's words warning him to mind his own business echoed in his head, but so did the image of Sophie's frightened eyes and her trembling hands. He couldn't just ignore what he'd heard. Summoning his courage, he walked around the side of the house, hoping to find a window he could look through. The windows on the ground floor were either blocked by heavy curtains or caked with dust, making it impossible to see inside. But as he circled around to the back of the house, he found a small window that was slightly open, allowing a narrow view into the kitchen. Arjun peered inside, his breath catching as he took in the scene. The kitchen was dimly lit and cluttered with dishes and papers strewn across the counters. In the center of the room stood an elderly woman, her back to him. She was hunched over, gripping the edge of the counter, her movements slow and labored. A faint wheezing sound escaped her lips as she tried to straighten up, and he noticed she held a blood-stained towel in her hand, identical to the one Sophie had been clutching. The woman suddenly turned, her face coming into view. Arjun stifled a gasp. Her skin was pale and sickly, her eyes hollow, and her hands trembled violently as she wiped them on the towel. She seemed unaware of him, staring blankly into the dim kitchen as if lost in a daze. He wanted to call out, to ask if she was all right, but something about the way she moved, slow, almost robotic, froze the words in his throat. He continued watching, feeling his stomach twist with unease. After a moment, Sophie appeared in the doorway behind her grandmother, standing silently with a worried expression. She looked at her grandmother, biting her lip, as if struggling with a decision. The grandmother reached out to steady herself, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter with surprising strength. "Sophie," she muttered, her voice barely audible through the window. Where is your father? He was supposed to be here." Arjun's heart skipped a beat. Father. Sophie had mentioned no one else, and he had assumed it was just her and her grandmother. Why would her father be involved? Sophie stepped closer to her grandmother, her face filled with sorrow. He's not coming, Grandma," she whispered, her voice quivering. "He's gone." The grandmother's face twisted with confusion, her eyes filling with a strange, distant sadness. She began to tremble, clutching her chest as if in pain, and Arjun realized she was struggling to breathe. Sophie gently placed her hands on her grandmother's shoulders, guiding her to a chair. "Sit down, Grandma," Sophie whispered, her tone soothing but filled with a sadness that broke Arjun's heart. "It's okay. I'll take care of you." The elderly woman sank into the chair, still holding the blood-stained towel, and Arjun could see Sophie's hands were trembling as she tucked a blanket around her grandmother. He felt a pang of guilt for watching them in their vulnerable moment, but he couldn't turn away. Something was clearly wrong in that house, and he felt an overwhelming urge to help. Suddenly, Sophie's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his through the narrow gap in the window. Her expression shifted from sadness to alarm, and she took a quick step back. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, both frozen in surprise and fear. Arjun raised a hand, trying to signal that he meant no harm. He mouthed the words, "Are you okay?" hoping she'd understand. But Sophie's expression grew more desperate, and she shook her head ever so slightly, a silent plea for him to leave. The message was clear, but Arjun couldn't ignore what he'd seen. Taking a deep breath, he whispered through the window, "If you need help, I can get it. I can call someone." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head again, her lips pressed tightly together. She glanced over her shoulder at her grandmother, who had closed her eyes and appeared to be sleeping. "Please," Arjun mouthed again, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let me help." But Sophie backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the kitchen. Moments later, the kitchen light flickered off, and he was left staring into darkness. Arjun turned back toward his bike, his heart heavy with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had seen enough to know something was wrong, and he couldn't just walk away. Not this time. Crossing the line, Arjun pedaled back toward Frank's Pizza, but his mind was far from the task of making deliveries. Every moment he spent riding away from 357 Willow Lane made his insides twist with a mixture of worry and guilt. Sophie's haunted expression, her grandmother's frail figure, the strange smells, and the blood-stained towels all replayed in his head, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Something was terribly wrong in that house. He knew it. And yet, what could he do? As he pulled into the pizzeria's parking lot, Gerald's stern face flashed through his mind. The man had been adamant. Don't ask questions. Don't get involved. But Arjun wasn't sure if he could continue following that advice. He parked his bike and walked into the pizzeria, the familiar scent of tomato sauce and melted cheese doing nothing to ease his nerves. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and Gerald glanced up from the counter, his gruff face breaking into a slight frown. "Back already?" That was quick. Arjun tried to play it cool, but his voice betrayed him. "Yeah, I wanted to check if there was any other delivery for Willow Lane." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Another delivery? Did they call again?" Arjun hesitated, realizing how suspicious he sounded. "Oh no, I just thought maybe they would." Gerald sighed, shaking his head. "Look, kid, I know you're new, but you're going to need to get used to all sorts of customers. Some people in that part of town are, let's just say, they don't live the way you or I might expect. It's best not to dwell on it. Just do the job, take your tip, and leave." Arjun nodded, but the words felt hollow in his mind. He wasn't sure if he could simply ignore what he'd seen. "But Gerald," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, "what if something's really wrong over there? What if they need help?" Gerald fixed him with a piercing stare, crossing his arms over his chest. "Kid, you're a pizza delivery driver, not a social worker. You start meddling in people's business, you're going to find trouble that you're not ready to deal with. Trust me on this." Arjun bit his lip, trying to shake the nagging feeling that wouldn't leave him alone. Gerald's words made sense logically, but his instincts told him he couldn't just turn a blind eye. The image of Sophie's frightened eyes flashed through his mind again, and he clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. Sensing his tension, Gerald softened his tone slightly. "Look, kid, I get it. You're young, you want to help. But this world isn't as simple as you think. You start getting involved in things you don't understand. You're bound to get burned. I need you to keep your head down and do your job, all right?" Arjun nodded, though he barely heard Gerald's words. His mind was already racing through possible ways he could help without crossing the line too much. He thanked Gerald and stepped out of the pizzeria, lost in thought. As he walked toward his bike, he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a text from his mother, a simple "How's it going?" that made him pause. His mother depended on him. Her condition had worsened recently, and she needed someone to care for her. Arjun's responsibilities at home were what kept him grounded, what reminded him to be cautious. But he also knew that if his mother were in the situation he suspected Sophie and her grandmother were in, he'd hope someone would help. With a deep sigh, Arjun decided he couldn't ignore this. He'd make one more trip to Willow Lane, this time without a pizza. He just needed to see for himself that everything was okay, to quiet the worry gnawing at his insides. If it turned out he was wrong, he'd be relieved. If he was right, he'd figure out what to do then. As he pedaled back toward 357 Willow Lane, the sun had fully set, casting the streets in darkness. The street lamps flickered, barely illuminating the path as he approached the house. The chill of the night air seeped into his skin, and the familiar silence of the neighborhood felt heavier, more ominous. His hands tightened on the handlebars as he rode down the cracked pavement, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. He arrived at the house and dismounted his bike, letting it rest against the overgrown bushes. The house loomed before him, silent and foreboding, and he felt the prickling sensation of being watched. Steeling himself, Arjun approached the door, but this time he didn't knock. Instead, he quietly walked around to the side of the house, hoping to find a window that would give him a better view inside. He peered through one of the windows but could see nothing but darkness. Just as he was about to move to another, a faint glow from an upstairs window caught his attention. He could see a shadowy figure moving, and his heart skipped a beat. It looked like Sophie, though he couldn't make out her face from this angle. She seemed to be struggling with something, her silhouette shifting and bending, her movements frantic. Arjun moved closer, his eyes straining to see what she was doing. As he squinted, trying to make sense of her actions, he heard a faint sound, like a whimper, coming from somewhere nearby. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. It was a quiet, pitiful sound, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. He crept closer to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Just then, he heard a door creak open somewhere inside, followed by heavy, dragging footsteps. He held his breath, pressing his ear against the window, trying to make out any voices or words. The footsteps paused, and he heard a faint, labored cough, followed by a raspy voice, a woman's voice. "Sophie, come here, child," the voice croaked, filled with pain and weariness. Arjun's hands clenched into fists as he strained to hear more. The woman's voice was muffled but had an unmistakable tone of distress. He heard Sophie's voice respond, though he couldn't make out what she said. The murmur of their conversation continued, and the sounds became even more desperate and heart-wrenching. Feeling his resolve strengthen, Arjun knew he had to find a way inside. He couldn't keep listening from the outside, while something awful might be happening just a few feet away. Moving as quietly as possible, he circled around to the back door, hoping it might be unlocked. To his surprise, the doorknob turned easily in his hand, and the door creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan. He froze, listening for any reaction from inside. When he heard none, he slipped through the door and found himself in a dark kitchen, illuminated only by the faint moonlight streaming through a small window. The air was thick with that strange, metallic smell he'd noticed before, mixed with the heavy scent of bleach. It was overpowering, and he had to stifle a cough as he stepped further into the room. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he could make out the cluttered mess on the counters, the dishes piled high in the sink, and the blood-stained towel draped over a chair. As he moved toward the hallway, he heard voices again, Sophie and her grandmother, their conversation tense and fearful. He could hear the grandmother's wheezing breaths, each one sounding more labored than the last. Arjun felt a pang of guilt for intruding, but he pushed it aside, knowing he couldn't leave without making sure they were safe. Slowly, he crept down the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He could hear the faint hum of a television in another room, and the faint flicker of light cast strange shadows along the walls. He moved toward the stairs, his heart pounding in his ears. Just as he reached the bottom step, he heard a gasp, followed by a faint thud from upstairs. His blood ran cold, and he felt a surge of panic. Without thinking, he rushed up the stairs, his footsteps soft but quick, each step making the floor groan under his weight. When he reached the top, he saw a light shining from a partially open door down the hallway. Taking a deep breath, he approached the door and peered inside. What he saw made his heart stop. Sophie was kneeling beside her grandmother, who was slumped in a chair, her face pale and her eyes half closed. Sophie's hands were shaking as she tried to wipe her grandmother's forehead with a damp cloth, her expression one of pure desperation. "Grandma," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Please stay with me." The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Sophie with a distant, dazed expression. Where is he?" she murmured weakly. "Your father. He was supposed to help us." Arjun's heart ached at the sight. He could feel the overwhelming weight of the love and fear in Sophie's voice, and he knew he couldn't stay hidden any longer. Stepping forward, he gently knocked on the doorframe, startling Sophie. She looked up, her eyes widening in fear and confusion as she saw him standing there. For a moment, she seemed about to shout, but Arjun held up his hands, his expression calm and sincere. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here to help." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her shoulders sagging in relief. She looked at her grandmother, who was slipping further into unconsciousness, her breathing shallow. Arjun knelt beside them, gently placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Tell me what's happening," he whispered. "How can I help?" Sophie looked down, biting her lip, struggling to find the words. Finally, she looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. We've been alone for so long. My father, he left us, and Grandma's been getting worse. I didn't know who else to turn to." Arjun felt his chest tighten with anger and sadness. He'd seen suffering before, but never like this. Looking at Sophie's tear-streaked face and her grandmother's frail form, he knew that this was just the beginning of a much darker story. The dark secrets of Willow Lane. Arjun's heart ached as he knelt beside Sophie and her grandmother, trying to absorb the enormity of their situation. The desperation in Sophie's eyes spoke of a long, silent struggle, one that had gone unnoticed by the world around them. Here, in this forgotten house on Willow Lane, lives had unraveled in quiet agony, and no one had come to their aid. Arjun could hardly comprehend how they had survived this long on their own. The dim glow from the bedside lamp cast harsh shadows across the room, illuminating the frail form of Sophie's grandmother. Her skin was ashen, her eyes half closed, and her breathing was labored, each exhalation rattling deep in her chest. Arjun had seen his mother struggle with illness before, but this felt different. There was a haunting, otherworldly silence in the room, as if the walls themselves bore witness to a tragic story no one else had heard. "Please," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't tell anyone. I don't want them to take her away from me." Arjun's chest tightened. He could see that this wasn't just a plea born of fear. This was a desperate final attempt to protect the one person she had left in the world. Her trembling hands held tightly to the blood-stained towel, clutching it as if it were a lifeline. He looked at her, feeling the surge of protectiveness for this child who had clearly borne far too much for her age. "I'm not here to take anyone away," he said gently, his voice steady. "I just want to help." Sophie's face softened, her wary expression easing just a little. She glanced at her grandmother, who lay motionless, save for the slight rise and fall of her chest. After a moment, Sophie took a deep, shaky breath, as if gathering her courage. "Grandma's been sick for a long time," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. At first, it was just little things. She'd forget where she put things, or she'd sleep through the day. But after my dad left, she got worse. Arjun nodded, listening carefully, his gaze flickering between Sophie and her grandmother. "How long ago did he leave?" Sophie swallowed, her eyes cast downward. "About 2 years," she said quietly. "He said he had to go find work, that he'd send money back, but—" She shook her head, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "He never came back. I think he forgot about us." Arjun felt a surge of anger on their behalf. The image of Sophie's father, a man who could leave his own daughter and sick mother behind without a second thought, filled him with bitterness. But he pushed it aside, focusing on Sophie and the immediate problem at hand. "So it's just been you and your grandmother here all this time?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Sophie nodded. "I tried to keep things normal. I'd make her meals and help her with her medicine. But it got harder. I don't know what I'm doing. And sometimes she... Sophie's voice cracked, and she looked away, her small shoulders shaking. "Sometimes she doesn't even know who I am. She thinks I'm my mom." Arjun's heart sank. The weight of Sophie's burdens was unimaginable. Here she was, just a young girl, forced to play the role of caretaker and protector in a world that had forgotten her. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, feeling a fierce resolve rise within him. He couldn't let her face this alone. "Sophie," he said gently, "you've done an incredible job keeping things together. But you shouldn't have to do this all by yourself. There are people who can help, people who know how to care for your grandma." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "But they'll take her away," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll put her in a hospital, and I'll be left alone." Arjun shook his head, his expression soft but resolute. "I promise I won't let that happen. I'm here now, and we'll figure this out together." For the first time, Sophie's face showed a glimmer of hope. She held his gaze, searching his eyes as if trying to gauge whether she could truly trust him. Finally, she nodded, her grip on the blood-stained towel loosening just a bit. "Okay," she murmured. "But you can't tell anyone yet. Please, just help me keep her safe for now." Arjun nodded, understanding her need for control in a world that had taken so much from her. "All right," he said softly. "I won't tell anyone. But let me at least take a look at her. Maybe I can help make her more comfortable." Sophie bit her lip, glancing at her grandmother, who lay slumped in the chair. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, stepping back to give him space. Arjun knelt beside the old woman, feeling his heart race as he studied her pale face. Her skin was cold to the touch, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. He noticed a stack of pill bottles on a nearby table, their labels faded and worn. He picked up one of the bottles, reading the label. It was a strong painkiller, prescribed nearly a year ago. Most of the pills were gone, and he realized that Sophie had likely been rationing them, doing her best to make them last. "Sophie," he said gently, looking up at her, "when was the last time you took her to a doctor?" She hesitated, avoiding his gaze. "A while ago," she admitted. "I don't have the money to pay for visits anymore. I tried going to the clinic once, but they said I needed an adult with me." Arjun felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't right. Sophie had been doing everything she could to care for her grandmother, but the system had failed her. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to get her the help she needed without exposing her to the harsh reality she feared: separation from her grandmother. As he sat there, lost in thought, he felt a hand weakly touch his arm. He looked down, surprised to see Sophie's grandmother's eyes open, hazy but filled with a flicker of awareness. Who are you?" she rasped, her voice barely audible. Arjun smiled gently, reaching for her hand. "I'm a friend," he said softly. I'm here to help." The old woman's eyes shifted to Sophie, who stood nearby, watching them with a mixture of fear and relief. She let out a soft sigh, her gaze softening as she looked at her granddaughter. "Sophie," she murmured, her voice filled with a tenderness that made Arjun's heart ache. "You've been so strong, taking care of me, all this time." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped closer, taking her grandmother's other hand. "I just want you to get better, Grandma," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The old woman gave a faint smile, her fingers brushing against Sophie's cheek. "You're a good girl," she murmured, her voice growing weaker. You remind me so much of your mother." Arjun felt his own eyes sting as he watched the exchange. It was clear that the bond between Sophie and her grandmother was all that had kept them going. He couldn't let that bond be broken, not when they'd fought so hard to hold on to each other. As he looked around the room, an idea began to form in his mind. It was risky, and it would require breaking a few rules, but it might just work. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice filled with determination. "I have an idea, but I'll need your help." She looked at him, a spark of hope in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Arjun glanced at her grandmother, then back at Sophie. "I know a clinic in a nearby town where they offer low-cost treatment. They don't ask too many questions. We could take your grandmother there and get her the help she needs without anyone finding out." Sophie's eyes widened, a mixture of excitement and fear flashing across her face. "But how would we get there? I don't have a car, and Grandma can barely walk." Arjun smiled, his mind racing with possibilities. "Leave that part to me. I'll figure out a way to get us there. I know a few people who owe me favors." Sophie hesitated, glancing at her grandmother, who had drifted back into a fitful sleep. "You'd really do that for us?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Arjun nodded, his expression resolute. "I would. You've been so strong, Sophie. You deserve someone to help you for a change." She looked down, her cheeks flushing with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. After a moment, she looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Arjun reached out, gently squeezing her shoulder. "You don't have to repay me. Just let me help." As they made their plans in hushed whispers, Arjun felt a newfound sense of purpose fill him. This wasn't just about delivering pizzas or keeping his head down anymore. This was about doing what was right, about helping someone in need even when it went against every rule. With a renewed sense of determination, Arjun rose, glancing back at Sophie and her grandmother. Tomorrow, they would set their plan into motion, and he would be there every step of the way. Together, they would find a way out of this darkness, no matter the cost. The plan in motion. The first light of dawn cast a soft, pink glow over Willow Lane as Arjun quietly pulled his delivery bike up to the back of Sophie's house. The neighborhood was silent, and the early morning mist hung low, giving everything a ghostly appearance. He'd spent half the night preparing for today, determined to make sure that Sophie and her grandmother received the help they desperately needed. In the hours since he had left Sophie's home, Arjun had called in every favor he could think of. He reached out to old friends from high school, people he hadn't talked to in years, trying to find someone who could lend him a car or help with transportation. He'd finally gotten hold of Ravi, an old buddy who worked at a repair shop. Ravi had agreed to loan him a beat-up sedan for the day, no questions asked, as long as Arjun promised to return it by nightfall. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As he stepped up to the back door and knocked softly, he felt a mixture of anxiety and resolve. This was a risky plan, bringing Sophie's grandmother to a clinic in a neighboring town, hoping that no one would ask questions or report the situation to authorities. But he knew it was the only way. Sophie's grandmother needed immediate care, and Sophie needed relief from the weight she'd been carrying for far too long. After a few moments, the door opened a crack, and Sophie's tired face peeked out. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and a wave of relief washed over her features. She opened the door wider, motioning for him to come in, and he could see that she'd been up most of the night, watching over her grandmother. "You really came back," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "I wasn't sure if you'd be able to." Arjun gave her a reassuring smile. "Of course I came back. I told you we'd figure this out together, didn't I?" Sophie nodded, her lips trembling with the beginnings of a grateful smile. She looked over her shoulder, where her grandmother lay on a makeshift cot in the corner of the kitchen. Arjun noticed that she looked even weaker than the night before, her face pale and her breathing shallow. They didn't have much time. "I got a car," he said softly, pointing toward the back of the house where the sedan was parked. "We can take her to the clinic. It's about an hour's drive, but it's one of the few places around here that won't ask too many questions." Sophie glanced at her grandmother, then back at Arjun, nodding slowly. "Okay, I'll help you get her ready." Together, they moved to the old woman's side, their movements gentle and careful. Sophie murmured soft words to her grandmother, who opened her eyes with a faint, groggy look, clearly confused but recognizing Sophie's voice. Arjun watched as Sophie held her grandmother's hand, guiding her through each step, her patience unwavering despite the exhaustion that clung to her. With Arjun's help, they managed to lift her grandmother into an old, worn-out wheelchair that they found in the corner of the kitchen. The wheelchair creaked as they moved it through the narrow hallway and out the back door, the wheels crunching softly on the gravel path. Arjun kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting a neighbor or passerby to notice them and ask questions, but the street was empty, and they reached the car without incident. Once they'd gently settled her grandmother into the back seat, Sophie climbed in beside her, clutching her grandmother's hand, as if afraid to let go. Arjun slid into the driver's seat, taking a deep breath before starting the car. The engine sputtered to life with a cough, and he carefully pulled away from the curb, driving slowly down the deserted street. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the engine the only sound as they made their way out of the city. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes fixed on her grandmother, whose eyes were closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Arjun could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on them, a silence filled with unspoken fears and anxieties. About half an hour into the drive, Sophie broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for doing this. I don't think anyone else would have." Arjun glanced at her in the rearview mirror, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. This is something I had to do. Sophie, no one deserves to go through this alone." She looked down, her fingers still entwined with her grandmother's. "I used to think someone would come help us, that maybe my dad would come back, or that the neighbors would notice, but no one ever did." Her voice trembled, and she bit her lip, as if holding back tears. "I didn't think anyone cared." Arjun's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "People care, Sophie. Sometimes they just don't know how to help, or they're too wrapped up in their own lives to notice. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve help. You're incredibly strong, you know that." Sophie gave a small nod, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I just want her to get better." Arjun didn't have the heart to tell her that her grandmother's condition might be beyond what a simple clinic visit could fix. But he understood that this journey wasn't just about physical healing. It was about giving Sophie hope, showing her that she wasn't alone in her struggle. As they continued down the road, he could see the clinic's sign appear on the horizon, a simple building nestled between trees at the edge of town. Relief flooded him, but his nerves remained on edge. This was the moment they'd been working toward, and he hoped the staff would be discreet and compassionate. They parked in the lot, and Arjun got out, helping Sophie with the wheelchair as they carefully moved her grandmother from the car. Sophie's face was a mixture of hope and fear as they made their way toward the entrance, the wheels of the chair creaking on the pavement. Inside, a receptionist looked up, her face softening as she took in the sight of Sophie's grandmother. Arjun approached the counter, keeping his voice low as he explained their situation. The receptionist nodded, motioning for them to follow her down a quiet hallway to a small examination room. A nurse entered shortly after, her expression gentle and understanding as she spoke softly to Sophie, asking her questions about her grandmother's symptoms. Sophie glanced at Arjun, nervous and uncertain, but he gave her a reassuring nod, silently encouraging her to share everything she knew. After a few minutes, the nurse nodded thoughtfully. "We'll do our best to make her comfortable and run a few tests to see what's going on. You can stay with her if you'd like," she said, looking at Sophie with a kind smile. Sophie nodded, gripping her grandmother's hand as the nurse prepared to draw a blood sample. Arjun stepped outside to give them some privacy, leaning against the wall in the hallway as he tried to process everything. This had only been his second day on the job, but it felt like a lifetime since he'd walked through the doors of Frank's Pizza. His life had taken a sharp, unexpected turn, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now responsible for Sophie's well-being. As he waited, he caught sight of a doctor walking toward him. The doctor looked to be in his 40s, with a calm, professional demeanor. "Are you with the young girl and her grandmother?" he asked, his voice low but compassionate. Arjun nodded. "Yes, I'm helping them out. They don't have anyone else." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Her grandmother's condition is complicated. She seems to have been in declining health for a while now, and she's showing signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration. It's clear the girl's been doing her best, but this is a lot for a child to handle on her own." Arjun swallowed hard, his heart sinking. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the reality hit even harder. "Is there anything that can be done?" The doctor looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and honesty. "We can stabilize her for now, but she's going to need ongoing care, a facility, or in-home nursing. It's not something the child should be handling on her own." "Do they have any family members who could step in?" Arjun shook his head, a pang of helplessness gripping him. "As far as I know, they're on their own. Sophie's father left years ago, and no one's heard from him since." The doctor sighed, nodding slowly. "Well, let's focus on what we can do today. We'll keep her here for a few hours, give her some fluids, and monitor her. After that, we can discuss next steps." Arjun thanked the doctor, his mind whirling with worry. He knew Sophie would be devastated to hear that her grandmother needed more help than she could provide. He couldn't bear the thought of her facing that news alone. Returning to the examination room, he found Sophie sitting beside her grandmother, gently stroking her hand as she rested. Sophie looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with hope and fear. Arjun took a seat beside her, reaching out to give her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "They're going to take good care of her, Sophie," he said softly, doing his best to keep his tone calm and steady. "We'll stay with her for as long as we need to." Sophie nodded, her gaze never leaving her grandmother's face. "Thank you, Arjun," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "You're the first person who's cared, really cared." He smiled gently, feeling a profound sense of purpose as he sat beside her. In that moment, he realized that helping Sophie and her grandmother wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a responsibility he was willing to carry, no matter where it led. As they sat together in the quiet examination room, Arjun knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey. But he was ready. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he was exactly where he needed to be. A new beginning. The hours crawled by as Arjun, Sophie, and her grandmother remained at the clinic, waiting for the care and treatment that Sophie's grandmother so desperately needed. The faint beeps of medical machines and the soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the air, creating a surreal calm that belied the weight of everything they'd gone through to get there. Arjun sat beside Sophie in the examination room, his hand resting on her shoulder in silent support, as her grandmother lay in the bed, her breathing steadier than before, but still shallow. Sophie looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, and her shoulders slumped, yet there was a faint glimmer of relief in her expression. Her grandmother's condition was stable, and for the first time in months, she wasn't facing it alone. The doctor returned, clipboard in hand, his expression as compassionate as before. "Sophie," he said gently, addressing her directly, "your grandmother is resting now. We've given her fluids and some medication to help with her pain, and she's responding well. But she needs more care than we can provide in a short visit. I'd recommend we arrange for ongoing support, a caregiver who can visit your home, or perhaps even consider a nearby facility." Sophie's face fell, and her small hands twisted together nervously. "A facility," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Will I be allowed to stay with her?" The doctor looked at her with a sadness that only deepened Arjun's own feeling of helplessness. "I know this is difficult to hear, Sophie, but your grandmother needs constant monitoring, and that's very hard to do at home. You've done an incredible job taking care of her, but it's too much for someone your age." Sophie's gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers clenching tightly as she processed the words. Arjun saw the fear and sorrow flicker across her face, and he felt an overwhelming need to protect her from any more pain. She'd fought so hard, and now it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. "Sophie," Arjun said, leaning closer, "we're not abandoning your grandmother. The doctor just wants to make sure she's safe. We'll find a way for you to stay close to her. I promise we'll figure this out together." She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his face for reassurance. Finally, she nodded, trusting him despite the uncertainty that filled her heart. The doctor gave them a sympathetic nod, then excused himself to make the necessary arrangements. After he left, Sophie let out a shaky breath, leaning against Arjun's shoulder. "I don't want her to be alone, Arjun," she whispered. "She's all I have left." Arjun wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice soft but firm. "She's not alone, Sophie, and neither are you. Whatever happens, I'll be here. We're in this together." They sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Arjun's mind raced with thoughts of how he could make good on his promise. He knew he'd do whatever it took to keep Sophie and her grandmother together, even if it meant going against every protocol and every piece of advice he'd been given. After a while, the nurse came in, her expression warm and gentle. "We've arranged for a local caregiver to check in on your grandmother twice a week, starting tomorrow," she explained, smiling at Sophie. "And since we know how important it is for her to be in familiar surroundings, she can go home with you today." Sophie's face lit up with relief, and she turned to Arjun with a grateful smile. He felt his own heart lift, grateful that at least for now, Sophie would be able to stay with her grandmother. The nurse continued, her tone soft but serious. "However, you'll need to make sure she rests and takes her medication on time. And if there are any changes, if her condition worsens, you'll need to bring her back here right away." Sophie nodded, determination filling her gaze. "I understand. I'll take care of her." With the arrangements made, they prepared to leave the clinic. The nurse helped them get Sophie's grandmother back into the wheelchair, and Arjun guided it carefully to the parking lot, where the borrowed sit-in waited. The journey back to Willow Lane was quiet, the weight of exhaustion settling over all of them. When they arrived, Arjun helped lift Sophie's grandmother from the car and carried her gently into the house, settling her onto the old, worn couch in the living room. Sophie sat beside her, stroking her grandmother's hand, her face a mixture of relief and resolve. Arjun felt a profound sense of satisfaction as he looked at them. He had come here expecting nothing more than a job delivering pizzas, but he'd ended up helping to save a family. The experience had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but there was still more to be done. "Sophie," he said softly, crouching down beside her, "I know it's going to be hard. You're going to have to keep a close eye on her, and you'll have to be strong. But I'll be here to help you. I'm just a call away." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Arjun. No one else has ever cared like this." He smiled, his voice warm. "You don't have to thank me, Sophie. I'm just glad I could help." They sat together in silence for a while, and then Sophie's grandmother stirred, opening her eyes and gazing at them with a faint smile. "Sophie," my sweet girl," she murmured, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you for taking care of me. And thank you, young man, for helping her." Arjun felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded, his voice thick. "It's my pleasure, ma'am. You've raised an amazing granddaughter." The old woman's eyes softened, and she squeezed Sophie's hand. "I know. She's my angel." As the day wore on, Arjun helped Sophie get everything organized, setting up a schedule for her grandmother's medication, going through the caregiver's instructions, and making sure that everything was in place to give her the best chance at recovery. It was exhausting, but he found a strange sense of fulfillment in it, as if this was exactly where he was meant to be. When he finally got up to leave, Sophie walked him to the door, her face a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice small. Arjun smiled, reaching out to give her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Of course. You're stuck with me now." She laughed, a soft, sweet sound that made his heart ache. "Good, because I don't think I can do this without you." "You won't have to," he promised. "I'll be back tomorrow to check in on you both. And if anything happens, just call me." As he stepped outside, he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him once more, but this time it felt lighter, as though he was sharing it with Sophie rather than bearing it alone. He glanced back at the house, watching as Sophie waved to him from the doorway, her face filled with a mixture of hope and gratitude. Arjun returned the wave, a sense of purpose filling his heart. This wasn't the end of their journey. There would be more challenges, more difficult days ahead. But they'd face them together. And for the first time in his life, Arjun felt like he was truly making a difference, helping someone in a way that mattered deeply. As he rode away from Willow Lane, he thought about how far he'd come. From that first uneasy delivery to this moment. He hadn't set out to become someone's hero, but somewhere along the way, that's exactly what he'd become for Sophie and her grandmother. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the city as Arjun headed back to Frank's Pizza, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He knew that his life had changed, that he found a new path, a purpose he hadn't expected. And as he rode through the quiet streets, he realized he wouldn't trade it for anything.